Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, and a warm welcome to this HRMI webinar. I'm Talia Keogh-Rowden from the Human Rights Measurement Initiative. We call it HRMI for short. And I'm your host for today's conversation on the global state of human rights, as shown in our brand new data, released publicly to the world right now. I'm part of the Wellington HRMI team in New Zealand, where it's just after midday now, and I know that people are joining us from all over the world, or at least half the world that's awake at the moment. Now, let me introduce the other HRMI team members you can see on your screen. So I'm going to hand over to Anne-Marie Brooke.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Anne-Marie Brooke. I'm one of the co-founders of HRMI, and I am joining the webinar from my home in Wellington, New Zealand, and I'll pass over to Chad.
Hi, I'm Chad Clay. I am also one of the co-founders of HRMI, and I am coming to you all from the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia in the United States. And I'll pass over to Susan.
Hi, my name is Susan Randolph, and I'm sitting here in Bolton, Connecticut in the USA, and I am also one of the co-founders and the Economic and Social Rights Lead.
And behind the scenes, we also have Cece and Charlotte from our Wellington, New Zealand team, who will be reading your questions, which you can put in the Q&A box, and helping us behind the scenes as we go through today. Now, we know that you have all come here today from different tasks and roles, and in different parts of the world and in different states of mind. So Anne-Marie is now going to help us make the transition to this gathering together. Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Talia. And thank you to all of you for joining us here today. We are very excited to share with you today just some of the thousands of stories that you can find in our 2020 dataset. But first, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the times that we find ourselves in and the massive changes that are going on around us. History tells us that pandemics typically usher in big changes. And we hope that the human rights data that we are producing will be put to good use by people like you to make sure that the big changes that eventuate over the coming year or years are positive ones that improve the lives of people worldwide. Now, since this is a virtual event today rather than an in-person one challenge that we face is that it is a lot harder to create the same default sense of coming together that we would have with an in-person gathering. And I know that for many of us, we're stepping out of very busy lives, and the stresses from our lives can still be very fresh on our minds as we join a new virtual space. So I'd like to invite us all just to spend a few minutes to ground and refresh so that we can arrive here together and be fully present. So let's start by taking 4 deep breaths together. So everyone please breathe in and take a long, slow breath all the way in, filling your lungs to capacity, and then slowly breathe out all the way out. And now again, breathing in and out. And now 2 more deep breaths in your own time. Nice work. Feel your thighs in your seat, your back on the chair. Get yourself comfortable, your feet on the floor. Great, and now I'd just like you to take a moment, and you're welcome to close your eyes if that's appropriate, depending on where you are, and reflect on what brought you here today. You know, what is your interest in human rights, whether it be personal or work or both? You know, which groups of people are on your mind? What aspects of our world are you working to improve? Just a moment to reflect on that. So you may be thinking about the importance of good health at this time of a global pandemic and the need for a good job or social security so that you can look after your families. Or you may be thinking about the ongoing struggle for all people to be treated fairly regardless of the colour of their skin, and for people everywhere to be able to go about their lives and speak their minds without fear of being beaten, for criticising the government, or potentially worse. Within the HRMI team, we have lots of different ways of talking about human rights. We measure human rights according to their definitions in international human rights law. But not everyone relates to international legal definitions. I mean, I don't have a legal background, and I can sometimes find that language a little off-putting. And so one alternative set of language that I've started using, which a lot of people relate to, is the idea that human rights allow people to flourish. We are each born with our own unique potential. Oh, I'm going to share a PowerPoint slide. Here we go. We're each born with our own unique potential, and a country that respects human rights is a country that allows each person to flourish. We want to help build a world where country decision makers make decisions by looking through the lens of what will most improve people's lives and better allow them to flourish. And we're motivated in this knowledge by the knowledge that what gets measured gets improved. I spent the first part of my career working as an economist, giving advice to governments on their economic policy. And I saw in that how incredibly important it is that policy advice be grounded in empirical, numerical evidence. And it was frustrating for me as an economist to bring, I couldn't really bring human rights very easily into my economic policy advice, because at the time I couldn't find a comprehensive database with data on how well countries are doing at measuring human rights. Lucky for me, I met Chad and Susan, who bring the expertise and rigour to HRMI. They are both world-leading experts in measuring human rights, and without them we would not have any data. We will be hearing from them very soon, but first I just want to emphasise that our goal at HRMI is to be useful. HRMI is not an advocacy organisation. We don't produce human rights data so that we can then use them ourselves to lobby for changes. We just produce the data in as collaborative a way as possible, and then we make the data freely available. We want to make the data as useful as possible for as large as possible number of data users: journalists, civil society, researchers, governments, philanthropic foundations, the private sector, risk consultants, and individual people seeking to improve the world around them. Whichever one of those groups you fit in, I hope that you will get some ideas from today's webinar about how to use our data to pursue your own goals. We know that it's not easy getting your head around a brand new data set, but we are here to help. And we very much see help as being a two-way street. Done properly, if we're helping you, then you're also helping us. And here's a quote that I really like. Collaboration is not about gluing together existing egos. It's about the ideas that never existed until after everyone entered the room. We're kind of in a room with you right now, although it's a slightly one-sided one. But I invite you to use this occasion to think about your own use cases and then get in touch with us. It might be today or tomorrow or next month, so that we can put our egos aside and our minds together to figure out how best we can collaborate and make our data even more useful for the uses that you have in order to improve the lives of people. And on that note, I'm going to hand things back to Talia, who will run you through just a few of the headlines from our new data set released today. Over to you, Talia.
Thank you, Emery. And you'll see that Charlotte has put our email addresses in the chat box to make it clear that we really do want to be useful and we want to be available, accessible, so that you can contact us with any questions you have. Today, we're really excited to be able to share with you and the world our latest measurement data showing how well each country is performing. All of our data, always, are freely available for anyone to use, including the charts, the numbers, the explanations on our rights tracker. And I'd like to invite you now to visit the rights tracker yourself. Right now, if you have another screen handy at rightstracker.org, feel free to follow along or to just take a look at the short tour we'll be taking you on today by watching your screen here. Now, Emery, in a second I'll ask you to show us some headlines, because you can explore our rights tracker in lots of different ways. You can look at 13 different groups of human rights at 203 countries, or at more than 30 groups of people who experience rights violations. And that means that there are thousands of pages and hundreds of thousands of stories you can tell using our data. And we'd like to show you a few headlines that could come out of the rights tracker, depending on how you search and what you're interested in. These are some things that caught our eye as we were looking through the brand new data. Here are the headlines, and I'll talk a bit more about each one. The first headline is that police brutality and systemic racism in the US are long-standing human rights problems. Secondly, human rights strengthen countries' COVID-19 response. We're pleased that we see human rights improvements in the Democratic Republic of Congo. LGBTQIA+ people worldwide experience human rights violations. Human rights deteriorate in Brazil under Bolsonaro. Another headline is that India could lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And our last headline for today is that the Pacific region is leading the world in safety from the state rights. Now I'm going to start in the US. And so, Emery, I'd ask you to take us to the rights tracker, rightstracker.org. And if you're following along at home, you can hop to the front page and follow Emery's tour as well. So we're going to search for the United States page. There's a country menu at the top and a search box for anything you want in the middle there.
Right. So we can search for the United States either here or on this country search menu. So I'm going to type in the United States here. And so just a quick explanation of what you see when you first land on any country page. On this at a glance tab, you'll see a very high level summary of the country's performance across three main categories of rights: quality of life rights, which are the economic and social rights, safety from the state rights, and empowerment rights. And more detail on each of these three categories is available in these tabs along the top here. Now, since the headline you're talking about, Talia, is police brutality, that fits under safety from the state. So I'm going to click on this tab here. And this takes us to some more detailed information about how the United States is performing on this right. And Chad, I'm just wondering, can you tell us what we're looking at right now?
Sure. Thanks, Emery. So for safety from the state, we gathered data on, as you can see here, 5 separate rights: freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom from disappearance, freedom from the death penalty, freedom from extrajudicial execution, and freedom from torture. And then we also compile those into an overall safety from the state score, which you can see at the top there. Now, the way we collect this information is by using a survey, and it's a survey that we send out to experts across the world who are actually practitioners who are actively monitoring, working in, and observing human rights practices in their countries or in countries they focus on around the world. And so, you know, we think that's one of the best sources of information on human rights practices available to us. And so we send the survey out annually, and using some both survey design techniques and some statistical modeling techniques, we're able to use the results of that survey to produce overall human rights scores for countries that are comparable between respondents and also comparable across countries. But while we do that, we also do it in such a way where we're able to be very honest about the level of certainty we have in each of those scores. So we also produce an uncertainty band for each of these. So as you can see here, Emery's hovering over arbitrary arrest in the United States. The United States receives an overall score of 4.1 for that, but we think it would be reasonable to say that that score is somewhere between 3.5, and 4.8. And so that tells us something about, you know, how certain we are in that score of 4.1. If that band was much wider, we would be much less certain. If it was much tighter, we would be more certain. So to turn a little bit to the United States, Emery, if you'll stay up top for just a second, I wanted to talk a little bit just about these relative scores. The United States, basically across the board on safety from the state, with the partial exception of disappearance, where it's still not performing great, it performs pretty poorly. The scores on arbitrary arrest, death penalty, extrajudicial execution, and torture all fall in the bad to very bad ranges on our scale. Now, one of the things that's on, I think, many of our minds right now are the protests going on both in the United States and around the world about police brutality and police killings in the United States. And all of that would fall under the category of extrajudicial execution here, which captures any sort of killing that occurs without due process of law by state agents. So anytime a state agent is responsible for a killing in a way that cannot be justified and is not part of the due course of law, it would count there. And as you can see, the United States receives a score of bad on that category. Now, if we think about what that looks like over time in the United States, I know it's at the forefront of all of our minds right now because of the protests. But the truth of the matter is that the United States has had severe problems with extrajudicial executions for a very long time. And as you can see, over the 3 years that HRMI has been collecting data on this issue, it's basically a flat line in that, bad range of our scale, where the United States is performing quite poorly and hasn't really improved over this time period. Now, I've been actually trying to measure this concept for a good bit of time in my career. And the thing that I've found is that it would probably look quite similar if we looked at this 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The fact of the matter is that police brutality and police killings have long been a problem in the United States. And so it's heartening that we're finally confronting that issue and taking it on head on. Now, the, protests that we're seeing aren't simply about the fact that extrajudicial executions are happening in the United States. They're also about the fact that they're happening in a fairly discriminatory way. And so if we look at our people at risk data, which is also from our survey, what you can see is that when asked who was particularly at risk for experiencing extrajudicial execution in the United States, who was likely to be killed by state agents in the United States, 64% of our respondents said people of particular races, and that was the most chosen category of the list that was provided to our respondents. Further, we actually give our respondents the opportunity to tell us more about what they're talking about. And one of the most frequently cited things was that people of certain races, particularly Black and Latinx people, were being killed via excessive police force. And so this is, really cutting to the heart of exactly what people are out in the streets protesting right now, which is a blatant human rights violation on the part of the United States.
So, Chad, you've said a couple of times that this is a long-standing problem, that you've been measuring it even before HRMI. Do you have any thoughts, or is there anywhere in our data that gives insight into why it's not got better, why things have not improved and been solved over the years?
I mean, I think there are a lot of answers to that question, Talia, but I do think our data can provide insight into at least one issue that I also think helps understand the current environment of protests in the United States. So, Emery, if you would take us over to the empowerment tab. So for civil and political rights, we also capture data on these three rights listed here as well: the right to assembly and association, the right to opinion and expression, and the right to participate in government, and combine those into an overall indicator of empowerment, which you can see at the top there. Now, what I'd really like to focus on here is the right to participate in government, which you can see also falls in the bad range of our scale for the United States. And so, Emery, if you wouldn't mind just kind of going down to our people at risk data. Now, what you can see here is that when we asked people who was especially at risk to have the right to participate in government violated, we once again saw that 64% of our human rights experts identified people of particular races. They are once again the most chosen category here. And when we sort of got more detail on that from our respondents, they once again pointed to violations against African Americans and Latinx people, and largely focused on sort of disenfranchisement and voter suppression efforts that are happening in the United States. So I think, one thing to consider here is that when we're talking about these, racial discrimination problems we're observing in the United States, it's not just in state violence. It's also in, the different things that people could possibly do to change state policy. So, when facing disenfranchisement and voter suppression, it only makes sense that people have taken up protest and non-institutionalized sort of means of trying to affect change right now.
And Chad, you said that the scores, the US scores are not great, they're pretty low. Are they just low compared to other fantastic countries, or are they low, full stop?
I would say that they're fairly low compared to everyone. So as Emery's showing you here, you can actually look at a comparison on each of our rights with other countries, right? And so if we looked at the right to be free from extrajudicial execution, what you see here is that there is not only does the United States perform poorly relative to countries that do well, the United States performs poorly in a fairly global sense. Compared to the other countries for whom we have data, the United States at least falls into the lower quarter on the right to be free from extrajudicial execution. Now, one thing I would note, coming back to my point about the uncertainty bands earlier, is I wouldn't interpret any country where the uncertainty bands overlap as being significantly different from one another. We can't say with any certainty that those scores are different. But by the time you get up to some of the higher end of the scale there, those states are doing substantially better than the United States is. And if we did want to compare the United States to countries that are at a high level of development or sort of high income democracies, right, then, we see that the United States performs quite poorly compared to other members of the Organization on Economic Cooperation and Development, overlapping significantly with Mexico, but being far below the scores we observe for Australia, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and South Korea. So this is a problem that's not just bad for the United States, it's bad from a global perspective.
Thanks, Chad. When people think of human rights, for some of us, the first thing we think of is the kinds of things that Chad's just been talking about, the civil and political rights. But of course, to flourish and thrive as a human being, we have all sorts of needs. And we also measure what are called economic and social rights, or what we often call quality of life rights. So Susan, I'm going to come over to you as our economic and social rights lead. On everyone's mind right now, probably 100% of us around the world, is the coronavirus pandemic. While we are all consumed with that, should we also be caring about human rights right now? What do you think, Susan? Oh, you're muted, Susan, I'm afraid. I know your internet connection had some trouble, but you're back. Okay. Right, so should we care about human rights?
Absolutely. In particular, the rights to housing and the rights to health are critical. Obviously, people need access to high quality, affordable medical care in order to reduce the toll from the pandemic. But as you've all probably heard, one of the best ways to limit the spread of the coronavirus is for us all to be washing our hands as well as practicing social distancing. And in fact, part of the right to housing is having the infrastructure of basic sanitation and hand washing facilities on the premises. So
that's something that we measure as well, the right to housing.
That is something we measure as well as part of our right to housing data. And in particularly, it's the indicators we focus on for low and middle income country assessment standard.
And Marie, if you could take us to the rights tracker to explore the right to housing. So again, at the top menu of the rights tracker on every page, you've got rights, countries, and people. And now we're going to spend a bit more time on the rights menu and go to the right to housing, where you're going to see all the countries in the world for which we have data. And for this particular right that we're looking at and the category of indicators that we're looking at, we had 190 odd countries, and we've just filtered it down so that we're looking at low and middle income countries. You can filter all of these pages according to region and type of country in lots of different ways. So Susan, what are we looking at here?
Okay, these are our scores on the right to housing for low and middle income countries. And as you can see, we have scores for 131 low and middle income countries. And as you saw before, we also have scores for high income countries. We compute both our low and middle income and high income assessment standards for all countries to the extent there are data. What's important to realize here is, first of all, there's a huge range of scores. And of course, interpretation is not the way that we typically interpret socioeconomic indicators. What these scores tell you is they tell you how well a country is doing given the income that it has. In other words, we benchmark countries' performance relative to the best performance we have observed over the last few decades in countries with essentially the same per capita income level. So if you see a country like, let's say Burundi, which has 100%, that doesn't mean that everybody in Burundi actually has access to water and sanitation and hand washing facilities on the premises. What that means is that Burundi is doing about as well as we could possibly expect given its per capita income. However,
we're measuring government performance rather than measuring how people are experiencing things on the ground in these statistics. Is that right?
Exactly. And for a country like Burundi to do better, we would find that not everybody is enjoying access to water and sanitation. But for Burundi to do better, it's going to need to grow its income or receive assistance from foreign sources. So if we go down further in the list, we find, in fact, that many countries could actually do much, much better. So if you have a country, for example, with a score of, let's just pause here at Morocco, of about 75%, that's telling you that relative to its current per capita income, it's only doing about 75% as well as what it could achieve.
So for most countries, if they're significantly below 100%, they could be doing more even without more income to ensure that people were enjoying their rights.
Absolutely. And we find that there's many, many countries that could do dramatically better without any increase in per capita income.
So we know that different countries, particularly for economic and social rights, have quite different challenges, human rights challenges, and also that the data that we use and that we use in our analyses is collected differently around the world for different countries. And so, some countries won't produce data on some things that others will. So, so we have two collections of indicators, don't we, for the right to housing?
Yes, we have two collections of indicators. One is primarily those indicators that are widely collected for low and middle income countries and tend to focus on the kinds of challenges that they face. And the other set of indicators are indicators for that are more reflective of data we can get for high income countries and reflect the sorts of challenges that they're most likely to face. Again, though, we do collect the data on both standards for all countries in the world to the extent possible.
Yeah, so we're not making a judgment about what country should look at what. We've got the data for every country on every indicator that's available worldwide. So we're looking here at the collection of indicators that we have collected together for low and middle income countries, and that's looking at water on premises and basic sanitation, which are obviously necessary if we're going to get through the pandemic. But what about for higher income countries? Emery, if I can ask you to switch us to the high income assessment standard using that switch view button, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, sure. So to switch the view, we click on this button and that pops up a panel on the right hand side with a couple of different options. And what we're going to do now is switch from the low and middle income assessment standard to the high income assessment standard. So that takes us to there. And so this then provides us with scores that reflect these two indicators, safely managed sanitation and affordable housing. Susan, shall we talk a little bit more about affordable housing?
Yes, let's talk about affordable housing. And that's also utterly critical to stemming the tide of this current pandemic. Obviously, we've been told again and again we need to practice social distancing, and we know that COVID-19 has run rampant through nursing homes and other sorts of institutional settings where people are crowded together. So social distancing is critically important, and having a home that allows you some space is also critical. So one
I think you were going to take us down to the bottom of the table here.
Well, actually, I was going to talk a little bit more about this.
Carry on.
Yeah, let me take you to the bottom of that. We can look at how some countries are doing. Again, the scores reflect the percent of achievement that a country is making relative to what it should be able to do. So for example, we look there at Canada, and we can see that Canada is actually only doing a little bit under 50% of what it should be able to do.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Susan. Now, Emery, I know you've been doing some thinking about whether this is the time to be thinking about these things, and how countries might be able to make improvements even at a really difficult time. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm really aware that the pandemic is having a devastating effect on billions of people, and I don't want to gloss over that. But it's also it's also presenting the world with massive opportunities for change. And I think basically we can see more clearly now than we could before all the places where our systems are broken and where they're working well. So I kind of think it's like the virus is holding up a mirror reflecting the reality of all the systems that we humans have built. Now, if we build a system that isn't working so well, we can recreate it. You know, one thing I learned, you know, in my years working as an economist is that there's a really strong status quo bias in government policy making. Most policy changes happen in a really incremental way, and it's not very often we have an opportunity to make more fundamental changes. So I urge everyone right now to think about how, as part of your job or the work that you do, how you can lobby for much deeper and more systemic changes than you might normally dare push for. You know, we need to be able to tell our grandchildren that we did everything we could to use this crisis to create bold systemic change for a better world. And data can play a really important role in making the case for change.
Thanks, Emery. That's a lovely message of hope. I think that's right, that we have an opportunity now. Emery, if I can ask you to take us back to the front page of the Rights Tracker, and everybody who's listening today, can I encourage you? We have plenty of time set aside for questions. If you have a question, can you please put it in the Q&A box, which means that everyone else will be able to see your question and add their encouragement for it to be answered if they also have that question. So if you put it in the chat box already, it would be great if you would just copy it over to the Q&A. And do feel free to add your questions at any time. And a reminder that you can be looking at rightstracker.org yourself right now. It's also multilingual, so you could be looking in your own language if you happen to speak one of the 4 languages that we have it in so far, English, French, Spanish and Portuguese. We have plans for 3 more languages in the next year or 2. So follow along on rightstracker.org and put your questions in the Q&A box. Now, we've looked at 2 of the 3 main menus at the top of Rights Tracker. We've looked at the rights menu and the countries menu. And I just want to show you one of my favourite spots. It's a new feature, the people menu. And if we go to all groups, Anne-Marie, we can just see a range of them. In our survey, which currently is out in nearly 40 countries, and we've been able to produce data for 33 so far, we ask people for each right that we measure which groups of people are particularly affected by rights violations of that right. We have a pre-prepared list of 30 or more groups of people that the list has been co-designed with users around the world over the last 4 years. And we add to it as people make suggestions. So do feel free to tell us if there is a group that's not represented that would be valuable for you to have data on. That's definitely something you could put in the chat box. So the groups that have been nominated so far and that we currently collect data on, you can follow along any of these paths and find all of the countries in our survey where anybody has said that these people are affected by rights violations. So for instance, let's have a look at LGBTQIA+ people. And if we click there, we then see a list of all the countries where any respondent has said for any right that LGBTQIA+ people are more at risk than the general population of having their rights violated. So let's have a look at Papua New Guinea. Since we're taking a bit of a tour around the world, we've seen a few different countries. So now you see the people at risk. We've seen a couple of those word clouds along the way when we were in the United States. And here you see all of the word clouds for all 13 sets of rights collected on one page. And where LGBTQIA+ people have been nominated here, they're highlighted for you just so that you can get an overview as you scroll down. You get an idea of where they're showing up and for which rights a lot of people have said that they are at risk. So for instance here, this gives you a sentence you can use in your reports, which is that 43% of our human rights experts identified LGBTQIA+ people as being at risk of having this right violated. So we know that all sorts of people are at risk of all sorts of violations, and there will be many that we have not captured. But what this tells us is that when people who were answering our survey were asked about, in this case, this is the right to work we're looking at here, when they were asked about the right to work and considering the situation in Papua New Guinea in 2019, nearly half of them had in mind that LGBTQIA+ people were particularly affected. This is one of my favourite features, as I say, and I encourage you to have a little look. There's lots to explore and lots of stories you can tell, lots of numbers you can bring to add to the case studies that you have of real people's lives who you know are affected as you are doing your reporting and advocacy. Now I'd like to have a look at some positive news. One of the great things about our rights tracker is that because we are systematically tracking progress, we can tell good news stories as well as pointing out where there are challenges. And Emery, you spotted something that gave us some encouragement. Would you like to tell us what you spotted when we were looking through this year's data?
Yeah, sure. So I was looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo. And one thing I noticed was that on empowerment rights, I'm just going to go there now and look at the time trends. I noticed a really big uptick between the two earlier years of our data and last year, 2019. And this increase is prevalent across all of the three empowerment rights, right to assembly and association, right to opinion and expression, and it's particularly large for the right to participate in government. Now, I know that DRC had an election, a long delayed election, I must add, and at the end of 2018. And when power was transferred to the new president in early 2019, that was the first peaceful transition of power that DRC has seen since gaining independence in 1960. So I guess the challenge now for DRC is to hold on to the improvements and further build on them despite the many challenges that this country continues to face.
It's so nice to see an upward movement, isn't it? And we acknowledge that the numbers are still not great. There's a lot of progress to be made, and DRC faces a lot of challenges. But those kinds of stories can also be told with our data. I spotted another line that was going in that direction that I was really encouraged to see. So Emery, can you take us to India now? when I was looking at the economic and social rights scores that we have for India, India's not yet in our survey, and we would love it to be. We currently have 33 countries for which we've been able to produce data using the survey, and we're limited only by funds. So if you want your country or your region to have civil and political rights scores, then you might want to speak to some people who have deep pockets and see if they'd like to fund us to expand to your region. But India, we do have good economic and social rights data. So if we go over to the quality of life tab and go down to look at the time trends, I noticed particularly that the right to housing, if we want to just have a look at housing as a whole, has this shallow but steady improvement line. And when I looked at the indicators that made that up, the right to basic sanitation, I think, was the steeper one. So if you look at basic sanitation, which means pretty much do you have your own indoor toilet in your house, that's the progress that India has made over the last 10 years. And I think it's significant. It gives me real hope because it says that improvement is possible. Nothing is set in stone, and poverty is not an insoluble problem. India has been making steady progress, and we would love to see that continue. It's also hopeful because it tells us that even at their current rate of improvement, that they're doing well. There really is a lot of improvement they could make even without more wealth. Our score says that on the current score of about 60%, it says that on their current level of wealth right now, India could have another 40% of people having indoor toilets. And we can even convert that into numbers of real people who are going to have access to proper sanitation. So Susan, I think you did some calculations of these numbers along with Livy, one of our researchers. Do you recall the numbers in India? If India managed to raise its score from 60 to 100% by really focusing on this, what would that mean for people in India?
Absolutely, it would be an amazing transformation. An additional 530 million people would be able to have access to basic sanitation. And imagine what that would do for health.
So Emery's taking you now to our other website, humanrightsmeasurement.org, because we have a section called Country Spotlights, and we've written an article with that figure in it. So on this article in India, we've done those calculations, those population calculations for all of our economic and social rights scores. So we've said for everything that we measure, if the country got to 100%, which is what we calculate is realistically possible at their level of income, what would that mean? How many people? And we find that 530 million people would have access to basic sanitation. We find that India could lift over 730 million people out of absolute poverty now without any increase in per capita income. I mean, obviously not right now. There are, it's not an overnight solution we're talking about, but money is not in the way, and that also gives me real hope. I'm going to take us across the world again now to Brazil. If we go back to the rights chapter, Emery, and we go to Brazil's front page. Brazil is in our survey, so we have a full set of data, both economic and social rights and civil and political rights. And the first thing I just want to notice, our headline was about Bolsonaro, who has been in power for a year or more, a year and a half now. But if we stay at the top, Emery, our quality of life income says that it's 2017. So that's before Bolsonaro was in power. Susan, can you just tell us why our data comes from then and isn't more recent?
Sure. The data that we use to construct our scores, actually the underlying indicator data comes from your publicly accessible international data sources. And that data initially comes from the governments themselves. Some of that data is based on surveys such as the Demographic and Health Survey. Other is based on administrative data. It takes the countries themselves, if they put the survey in field for a given year, it takes them a while to conduct the survey and process the survey. Then it also takes a while, once they have sent that information into the international organizations concerned, it takes those organizations a while to harmonize that data. And basically, by the time we have data on a particular indicator for the bulk of the world, we're at least 2 years behind date. And then it takes us a little while to process it and compute our scores as well. So that's the reason.
So we're measuring here, these scores are for how well the government in Brazil was doing in 2017. And
right.
that's the most recent we can get because of just the time lags of collecting data.
Right, but over time we'll be able to see whether there has been an uptick given his focus on the economy. Some economists would argue that should happen, or whether, given his lack of focus on human rights, we actually find out that the economic and social rights deteriorate significantly.
Yeah,
but
so we have
a
10-year time series on most of those rights, and over time it will become apparent, you know, when things move around. Yeah, and if we go down to civil and political rights, Chad, these are more recent. It says 2019. We've just published them today. So they don't say 2020 because they are measuring the situation in 2019. Is that right?
That's right. We had the survey in the field from basically the beginning of February to the end of March, asking respondents about practices in 2019 and 2018. And similarly, last year we had the survey in the field during about that same time period, asking respondents about 2018 and 2017.
So can you tell us what we're seeing here about Brazil? How are things going there?
Well, in general, Brazil is scoring pretty poorly on most of our civil and political rights indicators, absent the death penalty, which is banned in Brazil currently. The vast majority of the safety from the state scores fall in the bad to very bad range. The same for empowerment rights. All three of those fall in the bad to very bad range. And I think, you framed this earlier about, observing things since Bolsonaro took power last year. And I think, one of the things that's interesting to look at is if we can observe any change. And I would say that we have. So Emery, if you would mind going to safety from the state. One of the big changes we've observed over the last year appears to be in arbitrary arrest, which falls in the very bad range. But if we look at how our survey respondents have discussed it, we do see a decline from, particularly from 2017 to 2019. And pretty close to a significant decline between 2018 and 2019. So freedom from arbitrary arrest seems to be negatively trended right now. Things appear to be getting worse on that score at the moment. The same could be said for at least one of our empowerment rights as well. So Emery, if you could switch us over to that tab. So once again, we see that all of these are in the bad to very bad range, but opinion and expression lags pretty distantly behind the others. And indeed, since last year, we've seen what appears to be a change for the worse in the right to opinion and expression, where our respondents are really telling us that in 2019, that right was far less respected than it was in 2018. So, at the very least, it does appear that there have been some changes over the last year, and we'll have to monitor the situation to see if they continue or whether the tide can be stemmed.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. For our last headline, we're going to turn to the Pacific because we're really excited this year that we've been able to expand our survey reach to most countries in the Pacific region. And Emery, I think, do you have something that you can show us about that? You need to hold it a bit closer to your head. Yeah, there you go.
So we have just published this report, Human Rights Across the Pacific. It's the first time that we've actually published any of our, data releases in a kind of hard copy report. Usually, most of our scores are published only on our rights tracker. There's a lovely map on the inside cover showing the countries that we expanded to in the last year. This is the first full region of the world that we've done coverage of. And it's really exciting because our goal from here on is to expand region by region rather than adding a scattering of countries from different parts of the world. And in fact, I could mention, since we're talking about Pacific expansion, that we are actively seeking funding to make our next region of expansion the Asia region. Asia is a super interesting region because it has huge diversity in human rights performance, but we'd be equally happy to prioritise any other region for which we secure funding in the next few months. But yeah, going back to the Pacific, do you have anything more you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, Charlotte's put the link to the report in the chat box. That's available as a PDF download on our website. And there are several questions in the Q&A box about the Pacific, which is great, so we'll come to them as well. In fact, we might head there pretty quickly. But Chad, I know you've got some thoughts about what we've seen in the Pacific. Now that we have a whole region to look at, we are able to see a few trends and things. What would you like to show us?
Well, I think one of the standout things that's come from being able to expand to the entire Pacific region this time is we've gotten an interesting view on safety from the state rights, these physical integrity rights that we measure. And I think, as I mentioned earlier in this webinar, I've been measuring civil and political rights for a very long time now. And something I've always been very disappointed in existing data sets is that they have often left out the Pacific to a large degree, that the Pacific often hasn't been talked about. And so one of the great things I think about expanding this region is as you can see here, the Pacific does quite well in general on safety from the state. Now there are exceptions to that, obviously, but the top scores are dominated by countries in the Pacific, and I think that really says something about one, people not talking about these countries in the past and really missing out on lessons to be learned for their own countries from these places that are doing this quite well. And so it's just exciting to be part of a project where we're bringing these voices that have often been ignored and left out to the fore and letting them be heard.
Thanks, Chad. We've got several questions that have come in, and I encourage everybody to feel free to keep adding your questions and also reading other people's questions and clicking like if you want to put it to the top. We may not get to everybody's questions live today, although we'd be very keen to speak by email or Twitter or anything else if we don't get to your question live. But the top two questions that have been voted on so far do come from the Pacific, and we're talking about that now. So I think let's move into the Q&A kind of period. So panelists, I don't know if you've had a chance to read any of these questions, but the top two, I'll give a little bit of background perhaps that will help answer both of them, and then hand over to some of the rest of you. So Tuisena, thank you so much for your question. And your question I think comes down to what are human rights and how valued are they, and how do they change culturally? And in some Pacific cultures, the ainga, the village, the family units are they're the building blocks of society, and the individual is not elevated in quite the same way as in some other cultures. I think I'm summarising your question, and do feel free to add to it if there's something that I've misunderstood. So are we accounting for that in our data collection is the main question. Oh, I guess I've summarised our two sentences. Excellent, thank you. This is great interaction. So I guess the first couple of things I'd say just as background before we come to a specific addressing of your question. One is that I guess our goal in HRMI is to eventually measure all rights that are in international law. So we are trying to take an approach that takes what all countries have in common, knowing that there will be nuances in every country and culture where some things are more and less important or are expressed really differently. So we're trying to take a view of what countries have actually signed up to, what they've made promises about in most cases, with United Nations covenants and conventions, and we're drawing from those. And then the second thing I'd add is that all of our measurement tools and the way that we do everything are based in co-design, where we gather people together who are stakeholders and ask them what they want and how it should be done. So we at no point start by saying, here we are experts and we're going to tell you what you need and what we will do. We instead have 4 times over the last 5 years gathered people, flown them internationally to gather together for a few days, practitioners from around the world, people working for, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and other NGOs, academics, people who are experts in particular aspects of human rights, people who work for the United Nations and for governments, get them all in a room for a few days and find out what will be most useful. And our most recent one of these was a co-design workshop specifically focused on the Pacific region. So this time last year, in August in Auckland, we had 43 people from around the Pacific who just volunteered and said they were interested and wanted to devote that time and travel and energy to come and gather together to talk about what's important to the Pacific. So we made some adjustments to the overall international survey based on that workshop. And then also, because some strong feedback that came through the workshop was that there were particular human rights concerns for people in Pacific countries that were outside what we were currently measuring. We added on an entirely new extra Pacific module that went out just as a test run to start with. Last year, it went out, bolted on to the main survey. And so if you were a survey respondent in Samoa or Tuvalu or Kiribati, when you said that that was your country, you would get some extra questions. And the people at the workshop, the 43 participants, we came up with hundreds of different things that were important issues in the Pacific, and then voted together, well, not just voted, but discussed and voted and came up with 5 themes that people particularly wanted more information on, that they wanted us to conduct research on. And those 5 themes are discussed in the Pacific report. So if you go to that link that's in the chat box and download it from our website, then you'll see what data we've been able to collect. The issues that people wanted us to explore were how the climate crisis affects human rights, Indigenous self-determination, and that I think might answer your question, Nick McClellan, about self-determination, cultural rights and Indigenous land rights, and the last one was, everybody? Violence, sorry, the last one was violence.
Yeah.
Against 4 particular groups. So violence in the community against women and girls, against LGBTQIA plus people, against, and there's the graphs for the violence results that we have, against people with disabilities and against children. So again, these were co-designed, crowdsourced. These were the things that people told us they were interested in, and so we have started to measure them. Now, we want to, as we said right at the beginning, we want to be of service, we want to be useful. That is why we exist. We also acknowledge that we, the 4 of us you see here particularly, don't have expertise in the Pacific, and we want people who do have expertise in the Pacific and who are from the Pacific to drive this kind of work that is for the Pacific. And so we've been really delighted that two academics with Pacific roots, Sam Manuela and Patrick Thompson, have joined the HRMI team as our Pacific data leads, and they are now taking over to work on this Pacific module. These, at the moment, 5 questions, and maybe they'll be more or different in the future. And so they're going to be available to lead the work in the future to serve people in the Pacific and make sure that the things that people in the Pacific care about are being measured. So Nick, if I can move to your question, you say we measure participation in government, but we don't talk about self-determination, and surely those things go together, and we absolutely agree. Chad, shall I just hand over to you to expand on that, on how it does come through in the survey at the moment, and in perhaps how the Pacific module is addressing?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. I mean, I'm willing to acknowledge that I don't think we're quite there yet. On self-determination, and I think we can do better. Initially, we've had a lot of internal discussion even about how to present the results from places like Guam that are not granted their independence, that are essentially in a colonial state in the United States. And so, as it stands, we're currently just presenting those countries on their own and letting people that are respondents in those countries use our survey as a megaphone to speak out about what's concerning to them in that country at this time. But I don't think we've quite, in the rights tracker data, done as well as hopefully I think we eventually will in sort of analyzing and pulling out all of these self-determination issues. I do think that the Pacific module, one of the driving forces behind indigenous self-determination as a question and thinking about self-determination was this issue. I don't think, this first version we've done, I would say, was something of a beta test. We're not satisfied with where it is right now, and Sam and Patrick are going to take it and move it forward in what I assume will be a much better direction than what we've been able to do so far. But the hope is to capture at least some of these issues of self-determination, and to go back to the previous question a little bit, cultural rights that are currently missing in our data.
Thanks, Chad. Nick, if you have a follow-up on that, feel free to pop it in the Q&A or in the chat, or let us know if we've answered it or haven't. We're really keen for this to be as interactive as possible, and we're just sorry that we can't see all of your faces and hear all of your voices, but with 70 people, that would make us all quite small on the screen. So we're just going straight down the list. So the next question with 5 likes is from Corinne Tagliarina. I hope I'm saying your name approximately correctly. And Corinne's question is, does your data look solely at how rights are experienced, or does it provide any information on where legal guarantees of rights exist, even if they're not being fulfilled? So Chad, I think that's probably over to you.
Yeah, hi Corinne, I know you, it's good to see you here. As it stands right now, you could measure or think about measures of human rights in sort of 4 broad categories, and that's sort of principles, like how much have states signed on to international human rights treaties, policies, how much do those sort of human rights principles find their way into law, practices, which is like how does the state handle its human rights obligations, and then sort of enjoyment or fulfillment, the degree to which individuals are enjoying their human rights. As it stands right now, HRMI is really focused on the practices side of those sort of 4 categories. So all of our civil political rights measures as it stands are measures of practices, the degree to which the state is meeting its obligations. Most of Susan's data that we post are really about whether the state is meeting its obligations. And so we don't currently have a lot of information on our website about legal guarantees. Now, this is something we've talked about a bit in the past, and I think as we grow and expand, this is something we would like to capture more of. I mean, obviously the UN Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has some good information on this at the UN level, but we don't have a great data set for all of the different overlapping legal obligations states face when you include like regional obligations and domestic law and all those kinds of things. So I think down the road, we would like to expand and really cover the basis of not only all rights in practice, but also all rights across these sort of 4 kinds of enjoyment and measurement of human rights. And so that down the road, I hope we get there, but we're not quite there yet. Right now, we're pretty solely focused on practice.
Yeah, I think I'm going to sum up 2 or 3 questions in one. A few people say, are you going to measure X or Y? That isn't in there yet, and those are really good questions. They're all things that we want to measure. And Emery, perhaps I could hand over to you to talk about, where we go from here over the next 10 years. If someone gave us $10 million tomorrow, what would we do?
Well, I think, as I think you've already said, our goal is to produce data tracking all countries in the world on all rights set out in international human rights law. Given the choice between expanding our country coverage and adding more rights, I think most of us in the team would favour getting complete country coverage as a slight edge, a slight priority. Feel free to disagree with me if anyone wants to. And the reason for that is that we've had a lot of really important data users tell us that they actually can't start using our data for what they do until we have all countries in the world. So for example, we've heard from organizations like the World Bank that they'd love to be able to use our data and, you know, put it into some of their own indicators and indices. But they can't do that if we've only got 33 countries on our civil and political rights as we have right now. And since our priority is to get the data being used by as many, you know, organizations and individuals as possible to really start bringing about change, that would be our priority. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, our priority in terms of country expansion is to go region by region. And the order in which we expand to different regions will depend on funding and also on other, you know, alliances with organizations in each region. So I think as we expand to each region, we're really keen to form collaborations with organizations that are already specializing on human rights in that region so that we can expand the region in a collaborative way. Having said that, if there's a particular right that we're not covering and somebody wants to fund development of inclusion of that, you know, that's something that, you know, we'd just love to kick off.
Yeah. I think we've said before that, you know, we want to expand in three kinds of ways. You know, we want more countries in the survey. We want more rights, which includes, you know, whole extra work streams on different sets of rights, and more detail as well. So we've expanded over the last year. We've had more the ability to disaggregate some of our rights by sex, for instance, and the economic and social rights. Susan's been able to do that over the last year. That's a new development. And as more data are available, disaggregated by location or ethnic group, we'll be able to produce that on the rights tracker as well. We are, I mean, we're a young and nimble and energetic organisation, and so we are, you know, we have our fingers in lots of pies and our expanding tentacles in lots of directions. We're very focused on trying to find funding to expand to new countries, but we are also getting started on some of the new rights, and we've been delighted to welcome Drew Dalton, who is an academic in the UK, and he's the founder and chair of Report Out. So he's come on board as our SOGI lead, our sexual orientation and gender identity lead, so that we're starting work already on ways to measure rights of LGBTQIA+ people. And that may just briefly answer a couple of questions that have come in about, for instance, disaggregating the data of all of those letters. Yes, absolutely. We would love to be able to provide more detailed data on the experience of all of those people. And I will just note, I'm sorry, I've lost the question of who asked that exactly. Amy Cuzzolino. It was a really good question. LGBTQIA+ encompasses many groups of people. Do you disaggregate the data for each group or letter? Now that's a really good question. One of the ways that does get disaggregated a little bit is in the qualitative data, the answers that people give in their own words that we summarise on the rights tracker. And so if you go, actually, Emery, could you take us to New Zealand on the rights tracker, because I happened to notice that today when I was talking to a reporter. So if you take us to the New Zealand page, and if you go to safety from the state, these three middle tabs are where the qualitative information is, right down the bottom. It takes down, if you can turn the word cloud into freedom from torture. Okay, so the top group that was noted by experts in New Zealand talking about the right to freedom from torture was people with specific medical conditions, and then in the qualitative data you see below that something that was mentioned specifically was intersex children. And so that's one way that that one of the letters of the acronym has shown up in the qualitative data. And so if you're interested in a particular country or in a particular right, you might be able to spot some of those things that show up. And if you search by LGBTQIA+ and see where it shows up in the word clouds, you'll be more likely to spot where it's going to show up in the qualitative data as well.
I also wanted to mention that on data disaggregation, we're also piloting a tool that would allow you to compute our scores on a disaggregated level. So for example, if you have data on primary school enrollment amongst children with disabilities, you would be able to calculate the score for that group. and then you could compare it with other groups in your country or with other countries. So we urge you to try that tool out. It's in beta format now, but the more feedback we get, the better we can make it.
And I'm just going to pop the link for that in the chat box. For those of you, you have to really like data and numbers to be following along with this, but it is an amazing tool. Now I think I just put it in, but it disappeared. Oh no, I just repeated my other responses. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm trying to do these things on the fly. That was obviously a mistake. There we go. So there's a link there to our beta calculator that one of our team members, Jay, has developed. And if you have a data set for groups in your country on the indicators that we use, then you'll be able to compute your own scores that you can use in your own advocacy and reporting. We're doing really well on these questions. Feel free to keep them coming and feel free to keep voting for the ones that you are particularly interested in. Erin asks, I'm with Dignity Rights International. Love your work. Thank you, Erin. Wondering if you do any work relating to the right to dignity and environmental rights. So those are excellent questions. I mean, the overall answer is that we want to measure everything, and eventually we hope to. The climate crisis and how it affects human rights was in our Pacific module, and we have further thoughts about how we might be able to include environmental considerations into our general human rights. Does anyone else have anything more to say in answer to that question, Chad?
I mean, I would just add, Erin, I'd love to talk to you sometime about overall about dignity rights. But from my perspective, at core, this part of our motivation for trying to measure every single right is to capture the entirety of human dignity, right? I mean, at core, the entire human rights regime is about living a life of dignity and being treated with dignity. And so right now, there are things we could do maybe with our data that exists that we're not doing yet that we could sort of combine and think about an overall picture of dignity. But I think that's also part of our sort of future rights expansion, is I would like to see us expand to more human rights so we can get a better comprehensive grasp on dignity. But yeah, if you have more follow-up on that, Erin, feel free to shoot me an email, because I'd be happy to talk to you about it some more.
Thanks, Tat. The next question is from Ian Ferguson. How do you account for the knowledge or lack of knowledge of your respondents? Which is basically a question of who are our experts, who are our respondents. For example, in the United States, the vast majority of extrajudicial killings victims are men, but no respondents identified men as an at-risk group there. Chad, do you have a comment on that? I mean, the basic question is, who are these experts, and are they experts, and what do we know about them?
Sure. And so, I mean, this also ties in with a couple of questions below that other folks have asked about, other identifiers. And so to begin, our human rights experts are people who work either as human rights advocates or human rights practitioners for a non-governmental organization or something along those lines, trying to monitor human rights practices. Or they could be human rights lawyers who work on human rights issues within the legal system within their country. Or they could be journalists who work on human rights related issues. And finally, they could be members of national human rights institutions if those institutions have been deemed independent of government by, according to the Paris principles at the international level. And then for a few of our countries in the Pacific expansion with populations under 120,000, we did allow participants who were not politicians, police, or military, but who worked with or for the government to be respondents. And we've actually marked those on the rights tracker. But the way we get those respondents is via essentially going to trusted partners in each country where we started with, as well as our ambassadors that are located in each country that work to recruit respondents that work in these areas within the country and get them into our survey. But I actually think that doesn't mean that every single potential at-risk group is perfectly covered. So I'd like to actually turn away from who our respondents are for a second and talk a little bit about the interpretation of those people at risk data. So certainly if a group is highly selected in those people at risk data, we can say that that group is at risk for violations of that right. But just because a group isn't selected or is selected by a small number of participants doesn't mean they're not at risk. I would say that in some ways, if there are issues where you know, hey, they're not talking about that in the people at risk area, and I know that that's an issue in that country, then what that probably tells you is that we're not getting enough reach into that part of the human rights practitioner community yet. And what we'd like you to do actually is reach out to us and tell us, you know, who we should be talking to and who we should be contacting on those issues. So this is, you know, I think part of our growth as an organization each year, we have added more and more and more respondents to the survey, but I still think we're short of a critical mass in a few countries where we're falling short on you know, one of the things that comes up in a couple of the questions is on people with disabilities and mental health issues, right? And if you look on our rights tracker, we do have, you know, a area for people with disabilities and where they appear in those word clouds, but I think they're still underrepresented among groups compared to what we actually know the level of sort of experience of rights violations currently is. So you know, I think this is all part of our growth as an organization, but in the meantime, I encourage you to use those people at risk data to draw your attention to the things our respondents themselves were focused on, but not to use them as an overarching overall indicator of every single group that was at risk for violations of that right, because it just doesn't do that yet.
And just on that very specific example that you raised, Ian, you might just like to check out the people at risk cloud for extrajudicial killing, not just on the people at risk tab, but on the safety from the state tab. And you'll see there's the qualitative data underneath it. And underneath it, it does actually say men and boys, you know, it has come through in the qualitative data. So it's always worth just checking all of the tabs to get all the rich information there. Excellent. Okay, so I think we have, so Bill asks about rights at work, like the ILO conventions. I think we probably have the same answer, which is that, yes, we would love to meet at that. Does anyone have anything further to say about that?
I mean, I'll add a little bit, and I bet Susan could add a little bit as well. I mean, Bill, I already do a good bit of work on those rights as well, and I wholeheartedly want to get labor rights at work, right, into our data down the road. It's actually been on my mind. Emery could tell you this since pretty much the first meeting we ever had about this. I've been talking about it. So I absolutely hope we get there soon. But yeah, it's just a matter of you know, the funding to do so for us to do it. Susan, did you have things you wanted to add to that?
And Marie, if you wanted to jump in, sorry, Susan, did you want to add something as well?
Yes, I wanted to mention that we're also very interested in looking at ways we could incorporate the at-work component into our right-to-work indicators using the economic and social rights methodology as well. So that's something that's on our minds.
Yeah. And one other thing for people who are working on labour rights is that members of labour unions is one of our people at risk groups, and so you can follow that along if you on the rights tracker under the people menu. If you choose members of labour unions, you'll see all of the countries and for all of the rights where violations are noted. So they might, for instance, have violations of the right to associate in an assembly or other things. So thank you so much, Bill. Now, Elsa asks about how we're able to collect information about psychosocial disabilities when each state isn't measuring those things. Now, I think Chad and Susan have both covered that partly. Is there anything else you want to just round off that?
I mean, I did want to mention that I've really been investigating how we can incorporate the right also to mental health. And I'm really struggling to find indicators of that. Often I can find some good indicators, but I don't have any country coverage. So that's something that I'm actively working on because it's truly a critical component of the right to health that we are currently missing. So that's high on my priority list. Every year we actually improve our economic and social rights indicators a bit, extend them in different ways. This year we did some work on extending the right to housing to include affordable housing. That was one of our big innovations this year.
And I think the only thing I would add to that is just I'll just repeat what I said earlier, that if you know, you work on mental health and disability in your country, and you want us to, you know, we could do better, that we're happy to hear from you, and we'd really love to, you know, expand our survey to more people that work in the area.
Definitely. We have just a few minutes left. Do feel free to add another question, and we can respond to you privately or in another forum. And do feel free to keep upvoting. Eliala Fihaki asks, with regard to the categorization of rights, is environment refugees captured in any of them? And I think that question came up before we mentioned the Pacific report. So partly it's captured in the Pacific module, but it's a question that whether we might want to specifically include climate refugees as a at-risk category in a future time. That would be something that we can consider for next year, Chad.
I mean, I would just add that we don't have it split it out. We don't have it split out at right now from other categories, but this is another place where I would encourage people to go look at the qualitative information, because when people select refugees or asylum seekers, or when people select immigrants as being particularly at risk for rights violations, oftentimes in the qualitative information they'll tell us stuff about environmental refugees or refugees from war, or the very different circumstances that lead people to leave their homes and go to another place, right? And so you can get some of that information currently just by looking at the combination of the people at risk data and the qualitative responses.
Yeah, great, thank you. And a very quick question from Sharon that's been there for a little while. Any plans to change the label from SOGI to SOGI-esque or SOGI-esque? Sometimes the independent expert is labelled that way, to include sex characteristics and the I in intersex. We're very open to that, absolutely. We've got it. Drew is called our SOGI lead at the moment. He's been working in SOGI rights for some time, but everything is up for grabs at HRMI. We are always interested in hearing from people and making changes. So I would suggest that it would be great for Sharon, you may want to be in touch with Drew, and his address is drew@reportout.org, and he would love to hear from you. And Arthur Grimes from Motu. Hello, Arthur. On mental health, do you include suicide stats? Susan, any?
Not yet, but that's one I'm definitely looking into. It's one I'm already considering and searching the data to see if I can get enough countries.
Brilliant. Well, we're about to wrap up now, and I'd just really like to thank you all deeply and warmly for coming along and spending this time with us, and adding your energy and your interest and your curiosity and your questions and your commitment to making the world a better place. We've really enjoyed ourselves, and we have loved hearing all of your excellent questions. You can carry on these conversations with us. Charlotte has just put our Twitter handles in the chat box, and you can, this whole webinar is being recorded. It's viewable on YouTube right now, and the recording, slightly edited probably for clarity, will go up a bit later. So feel free to pass it on to anybody else who you think might be interested. And do feel free to go and visit the Rights Tracker, rightstracker.org, and explore and send us your questions. We would love to hear them. So do feel free to scroll through the chat box. You might even want to select all and copy and paste it so you've got all that information, all of the links and things at your fingertips, because it will close soon, I imagine. And all that remains is for me to thank you all once again. We work for you and for the benefit of the world. We wouldn't be here without you. Many of you are our respondents, I imagine, and you are the users of our data, and we would love to hear more from you about how we can be of use to you now and in the future. So thank you very much, and we're going to say goodbye.